Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to break down one of the most important and or extremely important features in FortiGate. User authentication, captive portal, how to authenticate users, and how these authentication methods are actually enforced inside firewall policy. In real world networks, controlling who can access the internet or internal resources is just as important as controlling what they can access. Whether you are managing employees, contractors, students, or guests, user identity is the foundation of a secure firewall deployment. And that's exactly what this video is about. So let's begin when we talk more about user authentication, and I will be explaining how to configure user authentication, what is captive portal, what are the different types of authentications. So that is all we are going to discuss. So the first important part is why authentication matters. So authentication is very important when you are configuring the firewall policies. So the firewall policies can be IP based policy or can be IP and user based policy. If you are creating the firewall policy based on source IP only, then you are only checking the IP address. And these IP addresses can be dynamic IP address or you have to reserve it and many other things. So we can have a user authentication along with the IP address, and so that combines both the user and the IP address, and it can be based on a subnet. So why authentication matters is controlling who is accessing your network, apply bandwidth filtering, app control per user, enforce security policies for departments, teams, or individuals depending on the username or group. Track user activities in logs. You can easily identify the activities based on the username rather than just relying on an IP address, right? Types of authentication in FortiGate. There are different types of authentication that can authenticate a user. One is local user authentication, remote authentication. So remote authentication can be LDAP, Radius, TACAX, TAML. We can have Fortinet single sign-on. We can have Radius single sign-on. We can have explicit proxy authentication, and we can have captive portal authentication. So local user authentication is a firewall local user. Firewall local user. Okay. Firewall local user. Rest all depends on the servers. So these are the different type of authentications on FortiGate. All these various types of authentication we discussed, like FSSO, RSSO, remote authentication, okay, then captive portal. So all these can be divided into two different categories, two important categories, that is active and passive authentication. Active and passive authentication. So authentication methods, okay, let me just clean this. So the firewall authentication can be categorized under two categories, active and passive. So when we say active authentication method, means where user receives a login prompt, means the user has to enter the credentials manually every time whenever he logs in. So user receives a login prompt, must manually enter credentials to authenticate. POP3, LDAP, Radius, Local, and TACAX, like these are the various different methods that can be used for active authentication. Now, passive user does not receive a login prompt from FortiGate, like no captive portal or no dialog box to input the credentials. Credentials are determined automatically. That means they are retrieved by using some application or by some authentication method, but the user don't have to input them. Okay, user don't have to input them. Method varies depending on type of authentication used, like FSSO, RSSO, and TLM. So these FSSO, RSSO, and TLM, these are the methods that can be used for passive authentication, while POP3, LDAP, Radius, these can be used for active authentication. So all the authentication methods can be categorized into either active or passive authentication. Active is where a user needs to input the credential and manually enter credentials, and passive is where users don't input the credentials. I will show you like active. This is one of the active authentication mechanism where authentication of users and group, it is more reliable than just IP address and device type authentication. Users must authenticate by entering valid credentials. So this is like active authentication, because on the captive portal the user has to input the username and password. Here click continue, and once he authenticates, then he will get further allowed by other firewall policies. So after FortiGate identifies the user or device, FortiGate applies firewall policy and profiles to allow or deny access to each specific network resources. Okay, now we have a password authentication. User accounts stored locally on FortiGate. For this method, you create a user as a local user. So this is the first method we told, like local user. So local user, when local user is created, then you create a local user, input the credentials on the device, define it, enable the status, and enable it. And then when the user connects, he needs to enter these local credentials in the captive portal and then get authenticated. Works well. And this is for smaller deployments, because you cannot have so many users created on the local firewall. So this is for a smaller deployment, not for a bulk or big organization. Then the next method is server-based password authentication. So in server-based password authentication, we create a user locally, but the password is verified remotely. So what we do is, accounts are stored on a remote authentication server. Administrators can do one of the following: create an account for the user locally and specify the server to verify the password. Add the authentication server to a user group, like when you are defining the firewall policy. So this is the second method where user inputs the credential. FortiGate sends this password to a remote server, and then the password is verified and user is authenticated. There is server-based password authentication where you can have a remote user, remote radius user. So this is for remote authentication, right? So you can select radius user, TechArx user, or LDAP user, and this user can be authenticated from radius server. Then we have LDAP also. LDAP can be used to integrate with FortiGate. Once the users are defined or created, then we have to use the users in the firewall policy. So you can see here external users and with the subnet. So where you can either call a specific user or you can call a user group. Don't worry, we are going to discuss all this in the lab. I will show you all the steps, how to configure, how to enable it. What is important now? This is very important here. If you don't check this, that means your authentication may not work properly. Okay. A firewall policy must allow a protocol in order to show the authentication dialog that is used in active authentication. So you have to allow these protocols under the firewall policy, because if you don't allow these, then the captive portal will not work and user authentication cannot take place. So all other services are not allowed until the user has authenticated successfully through one of the protocols listed above. So for local user authentication to work with an active mechanism, active method, you need to have one traffic from like HTTP, HTTPS or FTP telnet. Because captive portal or local user authentication can only be triggered by using these protocols. So first you have to browse like using a browser or something, get authenticated by the user, then you can access other services like any other custom ports. So this is very important. So you have to have a firewall policy and you have to allow DNS, HTTP, HTTPS. Okay. So DNS traffic can be allowed if user has not authenticated yet. That means even if you are not authenticated, DNS traffic can still be allowed, because even the captive portal resolution requires the DNS, right? Hostname resolution is often required by the application layer protocol that is used to authenticate. DNS service must be explicitly listed as a service in the policy. So there has to be a policy which allows the DNS specifically. Even if you say all here, then that might not work. You have to explicitly list DNS as a service under the service policy. So this is a mandatory requirement. Then you can mix the policy based on user authentication, user group, and a policy without any user authentication. But in this case, you have these three options. Enable authentication on every policy that could match the traffic. This is like all the policies should have. Second is enforce authentication on demand. This is CLI option only. And third is enable a captive portal on the ingress interface of the traffic. So this is like for all the users under that interface. Let's continue more on the active authentication behavior. Our today's video will focus more on the local authentication and active authentication. Passive authentication we will not be covering today. It's all about active authentication. So enable, when you are doing active authentication, you have to enable authentication on every policy that could match the traffic. So if you have like 10 policies, so all should have the username or user authentication, user/group. If a user does not matches this policy, the first policy, it will try to hit the second. And if there is no user authentication here, and if that matches the IP address based policy, then it can pass through this. So the suggestion is enable authentication on every policy that could match the traffic, and all firewall policies must have authentication enabled, active or passive, because otherwise they may match a IP based policy and you will be thinking how come it worked when there is no user defined. If there is a fall through policy in place, unauthenticated users are not prompted for authentication. So you will not be getting the prompt also if there is a policy without user authentication. And if the user is not authenticated or not prompted, even the one policy where user is mentioned may not work properly because the user prompt has been not given. There is an option in the CLI, enforce authentication on demand option, but this is a CLI option only. This forces the firewall to always authenticate the user even if there is a fallback policy. So what we have to do is config user setting, and under that you have an option set auth on demand, always and implicit. So that this you can change. So if you see the configuration here, under the config user setting, you will see the option, where is that, auth on demand. Yeah, auth on demand. So this is the default setting implicitly. So if you change to auth on demand always, that means even if you have a fallback policy, then also user authentication will be required. So here we had given in the previous slide, we have given three options, right?
So one option, enable authentication on every policy that could match the traffic. This is one way of doing. Second is by CLI, the option we just discovered, like auth on demand. Auth on demand. Okay, auth on demand. And third is captive portal on interface. We'll discuss now captive portal. We continuing with the active authentication behavior. The third option is enable a captive portal on the ingress interface where the user connects. For example, if this is your FortiGate firewall and user is connected on port 1. So instead of having an authentication on individual firewall policies, you can enable the captive portal on port 1. Enable the captive portal on port 1. So as soon as a client connects to the firewall, sends a request to the gateway through the supported protocols. You know the supported protocols, right? FTP, HTTP, HTTPS, and Telnet. I had told you about these protocols in earlier explanation. So once a client is like any PC. Okay, once a client connects to the port 1, sends a request, immediately he will be prompted for a captive portal to authenticate. And once he is authenticated, then you can use this user in any firewall policy. So this is authentication at the connecting interface itself. So enabling a captive portal on the ingress interface for the traffic. Authentication happens at an interface level. Traffic is not allowed without valid authentication unless it matches an exemption. So we have an option to create exemptions. We can create exemption. All users are prompted for authentication before they can access any resource. So if you see here, under that interface, if you go, you have to say security mode, captive portal, and then which user group. So this captive portal is restricted to this group, and redirect after captive portal where they will be redirected. So let's say if a user tried to access google.com, but he gets a captive portal. From captive portal, after authentication, he will be redirected to original request. So that is this original. A specific URL, you can send him to your company organization page or any other organization page, company page. So that is, you can specify the URL, or you want the user to be redirected back to the original website, whatever he requested. So this is the third option. So we discussed first all firewall policies. All firewall policies. Second, CLI option. And third is captive portal on interface. Captive portal on interface. Okay. So these are the three options for active authentication. Now, whenever you are performing an active authentication, so there is a timeout involved. Timeout means how long the user can stay connected or can stay in a valid, his authentication will be valid. So timeout specifies how long a user can remain idle before the user must authenticate again, or re-authentication, when it will be re-authenticated, right? Re-authentication. The default is 5 minutes. 500 minutes means 300 seconds. So this is the default time. Three options for behavior exist. One is idle, that means no traffic for that amount of time. Second option is hard, like even if you are sending traffic or not sending the traffic, still the authentication expires after this. So that you can say like a hard limit. Okay. And the third is based on a session. Authentication expires if no new session is created in that amount of time. So it is not based on the traffic, but it is based on a new session. Okay. So these are the three options for active authentication timeout or a captive portal authentication timeout. If you check under the settings, under the config user setting, we have set auth timeout type, idle timeout, hard timeout, new session. So this is what each options means. So the user authentication will be timed out after a idle timeout period or hard limit or based on a new session. Okay. So this is the behavior of authentication. Once a user is connected, you can monitor that user under dashboard and you can add a widget. By default, this widget is not available or this status is not available. So you have to click on the plus sign and add the widget for firewall user monitor. So once a user is connected, you will be able to see the user details since how long he is connected or what is the traffic volume that has passed. Method is firewall means the local user. So he is a local user. The same detail what you see under firewall user monitor that can be seen using CLI command diag firewall auth list where you get the IP address and the username, what is the source MAC, using which MAC he has connected, type of user, expiry. So this is the timeout. Okay, how long this authentication is valid, how much data he has transferred bytes in and out, what is the user ID. This is a index number. This is like internal to the FortiGate, nothing matters. Group ID and group name if this user belongs to some group. In my case, he does not belongs to any group, so that's why no information is shown here. 300 seconds or 5 minutes the idle timeout. Based on this, you can see here auth. So auth timeout you can see. So what you need overall? You need a firewall policy with user authentication, user called in, and DNS is specified specifically, and the firewall policies must allow the supported protocol for the first authentication to happen because captive portal only supports these 1, 2, 3 FTP. Okay, these settings like which protocols are supported by the captive portal are available under user authentication settings. So if you go under authentication settings, you will see here protocol support HTTP, HTTPS, telnet. Okay, so captive portal can only have the support authentication on these protocols. So to have an active authentication or captive portal, you need to first send the traffic on one of these protocols, then only authentication will work. Okay, or the ingress interface. Even the ingress interface captive portal, you need to have these protocols traffic coming in to the FortiGate. I have used multiple reference links in making this video to collect all this information. So these are the reference links from community.fortinet.com. And it's our lab time. During our lab, I will be telling you all the steps or step-by-step guide on how to configure an active authentication on a FortiGate firewall using a local username. In case of passive authentication, you need an FSSO or RSSO, which requires a separate agent to be installed on the Active Directory. I will be showing you all about active authentication. Let's begin our lab. Okay, so I am logged into our FortiGate firewall. I have got a client to test the authentication, and let's check one by one. There are 3 options for the configuration. So what we will be doing active authentication only. We are not going to do passive authentication, active authentication. Okay, for active authentication, what we need, the authentication is done by the captive portal. Okay, captive portal can be used in 3 ways. One is user, as explained earlier, user policy, user-based policy. This is first. Second is CLI auth on demand, right? Auth demand option. And third is interface captive portal. You remember from the content in the theory, right? Interface, captive portal on the ingress. So these are the three options. So first, let's talk about the user-based policies. First thing is you need an user, right? So what we need is we need a user definition or user to be created. User can be a local user or a radius user, whatever the method. So he can be a user or a group also. If you go in groups, it can be a user or group. So let's try the user definition option. So I have created this local user. I will just show you by creating one more user. So we will click on create new user, local user, say next. What is the name of the user? Let's say local user 1 because I am a local user, just for reference, and I define some password. I have to say next, enable, next. Status of the user is enabled, submit. So now I have a local user 1. So user is created. You have to go under policy and objects, firewall policy, create a firewall policy. For example, this is my firewall policy created, which says local user only. Or let me copy this policy and paste it above this. One more, I will make this for under this policy. You in the source you will choose the user. You can click on here user, local user 1, and I will remove the local corp user from here. Click on OK. Local user policy. So the policy is created and you have to enable this policy. This policy is enabled now. Okay. So I have two policies. One is like for this user, other is this user. I have not done anything else, no other configuration, only a local user creation. Under user and this local user, I have created local user 1. Going to a firewall policy, created a policy based on the user. Okay. So see, if you check here, I don't have any other policies, only user based, and this is a non-user based policy. Okay. So these three policies I have, that's it. No other policies with respect to this particular flow, port 3 to port 1, only these policies. And I have specifically specified DNS traffic to allow. Okay. Now if I go to one of my machine, okay, I got one more machine. I will log in to this machine and I will perform the test for local user authentication. I will open a web browser. Browser opened. Let me try a website. Some website I opened. When I try to access this website, okay, so we got the captive portal. So now I will try local user 1 and my password for the user and click continue. So if you see here, now the user should be authenticated. Yes, it's authenticated. Its website is opening and the website is open. So this is the user authentication and then redirected to the original request. So if you check the logs, forward traffic, I will make it like this, none. Okay. So from local user, see 1031.81.33.3, this matches the policy ID local user policy where we mentioned the policy ID, right? So the client.google or whatever I tried to open and cnn.com, it worked, right? Now if you go under the dashboard, firewall user monitor, this firewall user monitor is not available by default. Okay, so you have to add it. How you can add? Click on add monitor. You will see here user and authentication and you will get user monitor, but I have already added, so it's not showing. Okay, So you have to add the user monitor and click OK. So once you do this, you will get this users. So you can see the same user is authenticated from two different IP address, because I have it from my other machine, like two machines I am authenticated. So on this machine, the user is connected like since 11 minutes and this is 57 seconds. Okay. So this user monitor displays the users connected. If we click on CLI, diag firewall auth list. So you can see the same here. User authenticated, what is the like timeout or expiration for this. We discussed about config user setting. So this is the default configuration. All of this is default. So for to see the full, you have to do show full. You can see here the auth timeout is 5 minutes. We discussed about auth timeout type. So it is based on the idle timeout. This you can change idle timeout or hard timeout or new session. That's it. So this is the only configuration that you need to perform for an active authentication. But the confusing part here is how these policies, or like in a big environment when you have so many policies already configured and now you want to start your local user active authentication, active user. So now let's say if my policy is matching, okay, let's terminate all these sessions. Now we'll come on the troubleshooting part. Okay, so diag firewall auth list. Okay, diag firewall auth clear. Okay, I have cleared all sessions. So this is the command to clear all the authentication sessions. Diag firewall auth list. You will not see any user here. Even on the dashboard, you will not see any user because I cleared all the sessions. Okay, now let's take the flow. I have multiple policies here. So I have a policy which is also allowing telnet. Okay, telnet on a custom port 1337. Now if I access my device, okay, first thing is, even on this, let's say if I try cnn.com, what will happen? It again prompted me for the captive portal. Why? Because I have cleared the previous session, right? I have, okay. So now it's again asking me for authentication. Let's say I am not doing the authentication. Let's close it. These policies like user based, and a non-user based. I will try to, okay, I will try to initiate the traffic for a non-user based policy, that is port 1337. Before that, let me see if I have a valid authenticated session here. I don't have. I will go back to my machine. I will try to perform an traffic for non-user authentication. Telnet hack.com on 1337. What happens? It's connected, right? So it's connected because it's matching the third policy, and third policy does not require say user authentication. Okay, now if you check the logs, forward traffic, telehack custom port 1337, you can see this policy matched 11 into out telnet. Okay, so this matched the correct policy, but user authentication was not there. Now if I try to access traffic for a user authenticated policy, let's say browsing, in that case I need to have the authentication. Okay, I need to have the authentication. Okay, let me browse CNN, just for an example, cnn.com. I will input the credential local user 1 password. Okay, so it's authenticated and it's browsing. Now, if you check the authentication part, you will see the users authenticated under user monitor. You can see the user is connected and authenticated and matching the correct policy. So that is what the active authentication, where the user needs to input the credentials. And passive authentication is all about where user don't need to enter the credentials, and the FortiGate takes it using a RSSO or single sign-on agent. Maybe it is FSSO or RSSO, depending on DC agent and other configurations. So that we will be discussing or testing in a second or upcoming videos. For now, active authentication. Now, same way, the users that we created, the user that we created was a local user, right? So you can have a radius user or remote user also, and you just need user definition, and it can be radius user, and you can call this remote user into your firewall policy. Okay, or you can call the group. The group can be a radius group or local user group depending on the requirement. Let me know if you have any questions, any doubts on this. Hope I was clear enough to for all the topics, or any doubts you can just comment on this video.